All right, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depends where you're joining us from. Thank you for the live audience online and here in the room. So today it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Lawrence Armstrong, who is a professor emeritus from University of Connecticut. He was working in University of Connecticut for 28 years, and he has produced like more papers in the field of hydration than any other scientist that I know. I truly consider him as probably one of the modern founders in the field of hydration. And he has done work on everything from hydration, exercise, performance, rehydration, hydration and cognitive performance, health outcomes, and on and on. So it's my immense pleasure to have Professor Armstrong here with us today. And a little bit on the personal level, Professor Armstrong was my PhD mentor, so I'm really grateful for all these years of support and continuous mentorship, even up to today's. And without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Armstrong here to the podium. Let me start the presentation too. There you go. Thank you.
Thank you, Stavros. I have to explain a conflict of interest. I've known Stavros since the turn of the century. I've known Holly Emanuel for maybe half that time. But he and I have co-authored 25 papers. And Holly and I have co-authored 9 papers when she was at the University of Connecticut. So it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for your support on collecting the information for CEUs. That was an arduous process, but I'm glad we got that done. Today I'm going to present a bias, but I hope to do it as subjectively as I can. And my bias is about the way that athletes rehydrate. Here's the outline. Fasten your seatbelts. I have 45 minutes. Everything above the dashed line is about everyday activities. And everything below the dashed line is about endurance exercise. And the longer the endurance activity, the more relevant my points will be. In other words, if you're going out for a 5K walk versus a 24-hour cycling event, as they do in Europe, there's quite a difference in the type of drinking you might want to do, the type of rehydration that you want to use. So I don't have to tell anyone that's involved today that this is true. Certainly water is important. In this room, looking at the people that are here, water accounts for about 65% of your body by weight. These are the terms that I'll use today, but I often use them interchangeably because many people use them interchangeably, starting with hyperhydration. That's a temporary overhydration, which the body works to bring back to euhydration, or the normal, quote, normal state of hydration, which the brain accomplishes. And that's its constant goal, 24/7 throughout your entire life. The brain is constantly working to make you euhydrated, regardless of what we do to it. And then finally, hypohydration hopefully is not chronic, hopefully is not continuous or regular, but notice that dehydration is the step or the process of going from both hyperhydration to euhydration and from euhydration to hypohydration. And then rehydration, which I'm going to talk about today, is going from hypohydration back to that norm, which the brain attempts to accomplish 24/7 throughout your entire life. So first, I'd like to talk about basically everyday activities and the challenges many organs of the body involved in your regulation of body water and electrolytes. And this is a paper that Stavros and I published in 2019, 5 years ago, 6 years ago. And this figure shows in the upper left corner intracellular dehydration, but separate from that in the upper right corner, extracellular hypovolemia. In other words, the extracellular compartment, especially the circulation, can shrink. And that is a separate process from the intracellular dehydration because the body deals with it separately. However, remember that there's a constant attempt to equilibrate the two based upon osmolality, the concentration of both. So 24/7, all of your life, those two compartments, the extracellular and the intracellular, are attempting to equilibrate. Now notice that the primary mechanisms are thirst and renal effects, increased renal sodium retention at the kidney and increased water retention at the kidney. This is accomplished by the antidiuretic hormone, AVP. And this is accomplished by renin-angiotensin system, plasma angiotensin 2. So the sodium retention and the water retention work hand in hand, and water follows salt, so that when you retain sodium, you retain water. So this is not simple, it's complex. Stavros published an interesting paper which shows this complexity. This was in 2019. He looked at low volume drinkers during everyday life. And this is what he found. Those low volume drinkers had a low water intake, but their total body water was not measurably different. And they had no thirst. And their osmolality didn't change. What? What? How can this be? They're low drinkers. Why don't they drink during their everyday activities? He proposed the term underhydration, which was not on my previous slide of terminology, a new term, underhydration, to describe this odd set of circumstances for people who don't drink much during the day, often less than a liter a day, every day. And here he describes it in the article. A splendid new term to put into the literature. So optimal rehydration is affected by exercise because exercise increases the complexity of the regulation. Now we add, beside thirst and the kidneys, we now get the sweat glands involved because the body is sweating, and we now get the intestines involved because that's where you're absorbing the fluids. So it's more complicated than just everyday activities, even though the intestines certainly are at work in everyday activities. So when you look at these sweat losses, notice that we have basketball players indoors in an air-conditioned environment, just under a liter an hour. Soccer players, a little bit over a liter. Basketball in men and in women, over a liter. And then swimmers, 1/10 of a liter. Yes, swimmers sweat. They do. So we're starting to see that this is complicated because now if we try to give advice to athletes, endurance athletes, how can we give the same advice to all of these people? The last presentation last week by Bob Salas, the physician at the Hawaii Ironman Triathlon, said this: if you're Mia Hamm in soccer, losing 700 ml an hour is quite different than if you're finishing the Ironman Triathlon, where you may be losing 1 or 2 liters an hour. So the same advice, in my opinion, should not be given to all endurance athletes or all athletes that are very, very active. Thus, my bias. I published this 4 years ago. It's a figure out of an article that looked at rehydration during endurance exercise, and it was in the Journal of Nutrients. Now notice these things are involved, but let me show you the backdrop. We have this axis of being hypernatremia, high sodium levels in the extracellular compartment. And this is low sodium levels, hyponatremia. And this is a net body weight loss by dehydration. And this is a net body weight gain by fluid retention, which happens with hyponatremia. So notice the duration of the exercise is involved here. It complicates things. The fluid intake rate complicates things. Sweat rate certainly complicates things. Sweat sodium levels, there are people who have that rare circumstance, a perfect storm of a high sweat rate and a very concentrated sweat. They are the perfect storm of those who will have fluid electrolyte imbalances during exercise. Urine volume, which is reduced during exercise because the kidneys receive less blood flow. And then finally, sodium intake. What are you eating during the activity? Are you using gel packs? Are you eating pretzels? And you'd be surprised what endurance athletes, especially ultra endurance athletes, eat during their activities. And Stavros can speak to that. The great endurance event in Greece that you've published a couple of papers on, the Spartathlon. So you see, exercise complicates everyday sodium and water balance and regulation. So I often tell athletes, don't focus on event day. Start out during your everyday athletic activities. And these are 5 reasons. Again, fasten your seatbelt. I'm going to move through these quickly. It's possible for you to become sick if you don't rehydrate well. This is the classic paper by E.F. Adolph, 1947. They had soldiers marching through the desert after the Great World War II. And notice that at this point, Adolph said he found medical emergencies with a 7% body weight loss. Now, keep that 7% figure in mind, because if you march soldiers across the desert for hours and hours and hours with a rucksack and they don't drink, then notice the clinical signs and symptoms that occur, including renal failure, no urine output. So that's one reason. Dehydration affects physiological responses during exercise, and that demonstrates or represents stress. Here's a study that Stavros and I published in Journal of Applied Physiology in 1990. Long ago. We had 4 trials, but they were randomized, and the subjects were the same. And these subjects were either euhydrated at the beginning in these 2 legs, or hypohydrated in these 2 legs. And during this trial and this trial, they drank water during 90-minute heat stress tests on a treadmill in an environmental chamber. And here they drank no water in these 2 trials. So we were comparing them. Now, I'd like to compare especially these 2 trials to make my point about the fact that if you dehydrate, even during your daily activities, meaning you go into exercise hypohydrated, okay, this is what the figure looks like. And this, by the way, was drawn by Professor Kavouras years ago. Rectal temperature is different at 1% versus 3% dehydration during this 90-minute walk on a treadmill in a hot chamber. And also heart rate. You would expect that. If you're dehydrated, the extracellular compartment is shrunken and there's less cardiac output per beat. And so the heart rate rises to accomplish the same cardiac output. So clearly, athletes should be careful about their everyday hydration and not just focus on the event. Exercise performance. When I was a doctoral student, I worked with my advisor, Dave Kostel, one of the fathers of exercise physiology in this country. And when I was in his laboratory, this was my very first paper in Medicine, Science, Sports, and Exercise in 19. We had 8 runners who were accomplished road runners at that time. These trials were done at dusk. So the temperatures in Muncie, Indiana at Ball State University were mild, not hot. And so we had them on an outdoor track and they did 6 different trials. Notice the solid bar is hydrated and the dashed line is the dehydrated trial. The dehydration was accomplished with Lasix, the diuretic. The interesting thing about Lasix is that it's an isotonic dehydration. So what you're really doing is not changing the osmolality, but you're just taking the water out. It's an isotonic loss of that fluid. So it's like me putting you on a treadmill and testing you, and then all of a sudden removing a liter of your blood or your water in the blood or the extracellular compartment. So we were comparing what might happen to that circulation and how it might affect performance on the track. So we ran at the the metric mile, and these are distances that I ran as a track and field athlete in high school and college. So that's partly why we chose them. 1,500 meters, the metric mile, 5,000 meters, a 5K, and 10,000 meters, a 10K. And this was a competitive trial among these 8 competitive road racers. So we get a 3% change at 1,500 meters and about a 6 to 7% change at 5K and 10K. So again, if you were to enter a 5K or a 10K dehydrated or hypohydrated, you can certainly see that it would affect your performance. This is one of my favorite dehydration figures. It was done by Bob Kennefick. Robert was a doctoral student in our laboratory at UConn about the time that Dr. Kavouras was there. And he showed the level of dehydration from 2 to 7%. And he said that in 34 endurance exercise induced dehydration controlled laboratory studies, he looked at the percentage of observations that showed impaired performance. So 14 out of 26 at 2%, 8 out of 13 at 3% showed impaired performance. But when you get to 4%, 12 out of 13, 4 out of 5, 1 out of 1, and 2 out of 2. So clearly there seems to be an obvious threshold at 3 to 4%. But notice that at 2%, there's no guarantee. It's about 50-50. I love this figure because it's a nice summary. And you often see 1 to 2% is safe. So this seems to argue that in part. Not endurance exercise, but muscular strength, muscular power, and muscular endurance, high intensity, are all affected by a 3 to 4% body weight loss. So it's not only endurance exercise. And these are the 2 classic papers, ECSM and NATA. You can find these online, and they speak to these issues in great detail. Mild dehydration, like you might experience 2 or 3 or 4 times a week. Mild dehydration of perhaps 1% or 2% of your body water can affect mood and cognitive performance. And here are 4 papers that look at that. And women are affected differently from men, interestingly. And women seem to have a slightly greater effect of that mild dehydration on their mood. I'm not trying to be biased here, but I'm simply saying that that may be a positive thing. It may be a good thing. Because perhaps women sense a mild dehydration before men. And believe me, when the first water bottles started showing up in classrooms, I remember that day and I remember that year. And it was when I was a professor at UConn. And I remember that almost all, 90%, were women carrying water bottles as opposed to men. So I think that might tie in here with the slight difference, and you can check these papers to see the difference. Also, athletes should consider whether they're taking in what the adequate intake is. Now, if you have a nutrition background, you know that an adequate intake is different from an RDA, a recommended dietary allowance. And this was a study that we did. Evan Johnson and Colleen Munoz directed this study. But notice that these were 120 co-eds on the UConn campus. They were not exercising. They were not necessarily highly active. They were just ordinary co-eds on the campus. And these 120 women ranged from about 0.5 out to almost 5 liters a day. And notice the distribution, pretty much a normal distribution, relatively normal Gaussian distribution. Notice that I've marked 2 to 3.5. That I'm going to show you in the next slide is the kind of recommendation that's made by the National Academy of Sciences in this country and in Australia and in Europe at about 2 to 3.5 liters a day, depending on gender, sex, and depending on what your activity levels is. But these are the people I'm concerned about. To the left of the red line are the people that Stavros wrote the paper on low drinkers about, which I showed you earlier. They have a really unusual physiology because, again, their osmolality doesn't seem to be different. AVP hasn't changed much, and yet they're low drinkers. Why? Why do they drink so little day after day after day after day? The answer may be thirst. They may have a different threshold for thirst because there's another distribution, which I don't have a slide for, which we published with Colleen Munoz, that shows a normal distribution of the plasma osmolality for the onset of thirst. And there's a curve that looks much like this. And at a low osmolality, some people start to sense thirst, but some people out around 290, 294, 296, 298 finally sense thirst, as opposed to a 280 or 85 osmolality. So there's even a difference in the threshold for thirst. We just published this with Mike Bergeron and Colleen Munoz. Stavros was an author on this last year. And this review focused on chronic adequate intake. And we looked at a variety of diseases. And we looked at low urine volume or high urine osmolality in the studies that reported disease incidence, the incidence of chronic diseases. And we found that the association of low intake of water was strong when we looked at either urine volume or urine osmolality for both kidney stones, makes sense, and for diabetes with hyperglycemia. So those two chronic illnesses have perhaps a great solution, or at least maybe a treatment, if we watch their water intake. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could affect diabetes with water intake? Wow. Wow. A good thought. Here's the definition for an adequate intake, not an RDA. I don't need to tell this group that. And these are the dietary guidelines from Australia, from the European Food Safety Authority, and from our own Institute of Medicine in Washington, D.C. Now, I want to give you the standard of 8-ounce glasses, 8 of them. You often see online, and years ago, there was a great debate. Do we really need 8-ounce glasses of water? I don't think so. The kidneys can handle it. Yes, we need 8-ounce glasses of water because it doesn't help us if we're not drinking adequately, and the disease possibilities exist. That's 1.9 liters a day. An important number to remember, because here's the standard from the European Food Safety Authority, from the National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine in the US, and the Australian Medical Health Research. Infants, children, and here are the adults, men and women, 2,000 to 3,400 to 3,700. That's the recommendation for the adequate intake. How much do you drink a day? Do you know? Have you ever measured it? Aren't you ashamed of yourself? I'm joking. I'm joking. Yeah, you should know though. You really should. Yeah. I'm going to stop there and just say that now I'm making the shift where the dotted line was in my original outline. I'm now going to move out of everyday activities to the endurance athletes. And I want to say that the goal of rehydration during endurance exercise should be to reach a middle ground between dehydration and overhydration. Why? Well, the dehydration obviously affects your health. In severe cases, you saw the clinical outcomes that are possible in the Adolf slide that I showed you. Also, dehydration affects performance. But then on the overhydration side, obviously we have exertional hyponatremia, which can mean great illness in endurance athletes. And last week, Bob Salas spoke about the Hawaii Ironman triathlon, and he explained what those athletes were like and what symptoms and signs they had in the medical tent when they came in with exertional hyponatremia or exercise-associated hyponatremia. So we need to avoid that significant electrolyte imbalance. Now, part of that imbalance on the hyponatremia side, exercise-associated hyponatremia, part of that imbalance is sweat sodium loss. And part of that imbalance on the hyponatremia is overhydration and retention of water. So it's complicated. It's complicated. And Bob Salas sees it every time he participates and monitors the medical tent. I've been in that medical tent 3 times myself in Kona in Hawaii. It's remarkable to see them come in. If you've never seen it, there's a 24-hour limit. And you can go out and stand at the finish line and watch the finishers come in. And if you saw the presentation last week, one of the videos of that finish. It's remarkable. Nothing fun, very serious. So here we have a similar slide to the one I showed you earlier. We can talk about dietary sodium excess or excessive sodium loss or inadequate sodium intake in the diet. And notice on the other axis, fluid overload and dehydration. So interestingly, we have two types of exercise-associated hyponatremia. Exercise-associated hyponatremia shows up with fluid overload, but there are also a few cases of exercise-associated hyponatremia that shows up with dehydration. Wow, what does that mean? That means they must have the perfect storm. High sweat loss, high sweat sodium, and they're not taking in sodium during the extreme endurance event. So those two extremes of hyponatremia are evident and in the literature. Did you know there are 5 options? And this is all I could figure out when I published this article in a year ago, a couple of years ago, 4 years ago. There are 5 options for what athletes can do as far as having a plan or the approach to their hydration. Not all of these, by the way, are plans, but most serious athletes, especially ultra endurance athletes, have a plan of some kind. Now, I want to say that for number 4 and number 5, no professional sports medicine or sport nutrition organization recommends plan 4 or plan 5. So I'm going to focus on these 3. And these 3 are drink when thirsty, drinking to thirst, ad libitum drinking, and I'll explain the difference. I believe there's a difference. Ad libitum is not the same as drinking to thirst. And then finally, individualized planned drinking, IPD. Now this one says purposely drink nothing. Well, who does that? And then this one says drink as much as possible. And you know, I have to stop and say ACSM years ago was blamed by many investigators around the world for causing, or at least stimulating exercise-associated hyponatremia due to one position stand. And I was a member of that position stand. And I know what we said, and we didn't say drink as much as possible forever and ever and ever. We didn't say that, but it appears in the literature. I can show you a number of publications that claim that. And there was this debate ongoing. Finally, I think it's been settled that ACSM really did not say that, okay? IPD, individualized planned drinking, involves measuring an athlete's sweat rate and planning the appropriate volume and timing of fluid intake in view of the environmental conditions, the options for rehydration. What are the aid stations? Can I carry a container of water? Cyclists, a lot easier. They can put the water on the frame of their bike. They can carry it in their jersey, whereas runners have the clunky water bottle and they're lopsided with it and they don't like to carry that. Most runners do not do that, but it depends on all those things to get a plan. And this refers to an individualized drinking plan in advance. DTT, you should drink only when you're thirsty. Now, who started that idea? Those who were interested in avoiding exercise-associated hyponatremia. If you drink to thirst, it's very unlikely that you'll experience exercise-associated hyponatremia. So it's a different group, mainly clinicians, mainly the doctors like Bob Salas who see the exercise-associated hyponatremia. They advise drink to thirst. But if you're a really carefully planned elite athlete or a recreational athlete who likes to plan things out, you're organized like everybody in this room, you think ahead, you plan ahead, then an individualized planned drinking approach is obviously the best. Now, ad libitum, you drink whenever and whatever without specific focus on thirst. Just do it. Okay, so that's really slightly different from thirst, drinking to thirst. IPD versus drinking to thirst. And I'm going to say that ad libitum drinking and drinking to thirst, although the stimulus and the focus of the athlete is a slightly different, they actually have a similar outcome. And we showed that in hotter than hell data here that you can see. This was published in 2014. It came from the Hotter Than Hell 100 cycling event in Wichita Falls, Texas. And we showed basically that when you look at those who had drinking to thirst as their motivation to drink, and that's all they did. They drank only during a 100-mile cycling event in Texas in about 96 degrees Fahrenheit. They drank only when they were thirsty versus those who drank whenever and whatever. So we had two groups and we separated them before the study. There was no intervention. They could drink what they wanted to drink. But we found that in the end, they both drank about the same amount and their symptoms and their physiology were quite similar. So that's why I lump those two together, even though they're slightly different. Well, just a few slides. Hotter than hell 100. Whoa. Whoa. When we were there, it was the largest cycling event in America. This is what the course looks like. You start and finish in Wichita Falls. We had our medical tent at the start and finish line. We set up a medical tent and do what you do here. Blood samples, body weights, on and on and on in the tent, as much as we could in a field medical tent, okay? Wow, 100 miles. And the course went around Wichita Falls. There was something called Hell's Gate, and that was a place if you were an unaccomplished rider, a novice rider, and you said, hey, I need to get back, I'm not feeling good. They gave you a shortcut and you could cut directly to the finish line. That was a safety valve. They also called off, with an early start in the morning, they called off riders after 12 noon at Hell's Gate, and they made them go that way. They wouldn't let them go on for the rest of the distance. This is what the team looked like, a motley crew indeed, and you'll notice this gentleman right here. This was a Yukon project. You'll notice this lady right here, busily collecting data on one of the cyclists. We did, of course, body weights and body weight loss, drew blood, analyzed the blood in our field station. Now, at the Hotter Than Hell 100, I abbreviate that HHH, notice on day -1, they had to come to the expo center in Wichita Falls, Texas, and they had to collect their bib. And we recruited them there. We also sent out announcements to all those who asked for advanced registration. So we collected test subjects that way. We briefed them, gave them full informed consent, as you do with studies. And we found that on day -1, when we did their water and fluid recalls, that this is what they drank. Quite a variety of fluids. Okay, now, how does that look on event day? Same people, next day, riding 100 miles at 96 degrees Fahrenheit. Wow. Now, if you know anything about cycling and exercise, you're thinking, well, CE is carbohydrate electrolyte beverage. And that shouldn't surprise you. Water, that shouldn't surprise you. Other, some took pickled juice because it was big in Texas. Get that sodium. But when you compare them, it's complicated. Can you say, drink to thirst? I don't know what that means. So you start to see my bias about drinking to thirst. Here's another figure. I published this one in Nutrients in 2021. Here's thirst in green. Here's drinking behavior in blue. Decreased blood volume and pressure, cellular, intracellular dehydration, oropharyngeal sensations, and mouth dryness, which feeds directly to the brain and affects AVP, by the way, in the blood, without even going to the stomach or the blood. Increased plasma osmolality, the primary stimulus to AVP, increase or decrease. So thirst then feeds into the actual behavior of drinking. Perceptions that reinforce thirst. We published a study at UConn a few years after this, showing that there are a number of perceptions that occur with thirst that reinforce it, and some perceptions that you never believe. So if you're interested in thirst and that particular set of papers, I'll be glad to provide that for you. previous experiences, beliefs and advice from others, especially coaches, fluid palatability. Is it palatable? Do they like to drink it? Does it taste good? Is it cold? And then focus. Now, if you're on a bike and you're riding 100 miles and it takes you 9 hours or 10 hours, or if you're really hammering and it goes 5 hours or 4.5 hours, you're really a hot, really talented cyclist, then your focus is not on thirst. They drink less often. They drink more sometimes. So it's a matter of thinking about, do I drink to thirst? Do I think about that, or am I thinking about the competition and the next hill or the finish line? All of that feeds in. So you start to see that this is complicated, it's complex and dynamic. And a few years ago, I fell in love with that phrase, dynamic complexity. Dynamic complexity. I get bored saying it so much, but I love it, and it's true. So now I've eliminated, notice, the ad libitum. I'm going to lump that with drinking to thirst, and I'm just going to talk now about IPD and DTT. Here's the debate, and this was a fun paper. I worked with Evan Johnson, University of Wyoming. He's soon moving to Quinnipiac University in Connecticut, and Evan will be there starting in January as a full professor. And I also worked with Mike Bergeron, and Michael is the guru of machine learning. If you're familiar with machine learning, he and I have paired up on a number of studies and papers, especially one I'll show you in a few minutes. And we debated Martin Hoffman, who was the former editor of Wilderness and Environmental Medicine, Wilderness and Emergency Medicine, and James Cotter and Eric Goulet and Paul Lawson. They're from Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. Well, the three of us from the USA debated them, yes or no, should you drink to thirst? And they were talking about drinking to thirst from the standpoint of exercise-associated hyponatremia. We were focusing on performance, and if you're planning your drinking, you will not become exercise-associated hyponatremic. If you've got planned drinking, you will not become hyponatremic. So we were accomplishing what the clinicians were trying to avoid, but we were also focusing on the fact that we were enhancing or optimizing performance with planned drinking. Thus, my bias. And this is a fun paper to read. If you want to get that, here's the reference on it, and I'll be glad to provide that to you if you send me an email. So what do laboratory and field studies indicate about drinking to thirst? Before the presentation, I asked Stavros, what are the studies that you know that support drinking to thirst? In my experience, here they are, 2, okay? But read the fine print. Down here, yeah, it seems that we need to look at it in a real life situation, not in a laboratory. Okay, so there's the drawback. There's one caveat. And look at this particular article. I think at the bottom here is talking about 60% VO2, and the fact that 60% VO2 is not intense, not high intensity. In fact, if you're walking on a treadmill at about 50%, you're a very brisk walk, and if you go to 55, you're basically slow jogging. 60% is basically a moderate jog if you're running. So not very high intensity, and pardon me, 600 ml sweat rate. Think back to what I showed you earlier about the sweat rates of athletes. 600 ml is quite a low sweat rate. So, you know, really these 2 studies are the only 2 that I know that support drinking to thirst. And if you know of others, please send them to me. I'd be glad to read them. But, you know, these 2 caveats in these 2 studies don't convince me much. Yet, it's complicated. This was a study in 2015 from the Hotter Than Hell 100. And we correlated thirst rating with a number of variables. Post-event thirst against body mass changes, height, body mass index, ground speed, the cycling speed, water balance, we looked at their body water balance, change of body mass was affected also by even the delta of thirst. None of these correlated significantly with thirst. So now, wait a minute. Thirst doesn't correlate with performance. It doesn't correlate with body weight loss. It doesn't correlate with ground speed. It doesn't correlate with height or BMI. What are we doing here? Why are we drinking to thirst? You start to see my bias. And it really raises a question about the idea of drinking to thirst. This was a study done by Ron Munn and Susan Sheriffs in Loughborough when they were there at the university. And they are two of the finest physiologists in hydration research for many, many years. And Craig Horswell was at the Gatorade Sports Science Institute at that time. So they gave soccer players, football players, free access to water in individually identified water bottles, and the coaching staff allowed regular breaks during their training sessions. Down here was their conclusion. There was no apparent relationship between the amount of sweat lost and the volume of fluid consumed during the training. And here's the correlation: sweat loss, water intake. The correlation showed R squared of 0.013. So that means that 1% of one variable was accounted for by the other variable. In other words, water intake only accounted for 1% of the sweat loss. Questions drinking to thirst. Open water swimming. Imagine talking to a swimmer about thirst, right? If you know anything about open water swimming, and by the way, you may not know, this gentleman right here, Dr. Kavouras, represented Greece in the World Championships in swimming years ago. So he knows about swimming, okay? Quite an athlete. And asking him about open water swimming, do you think they ingest water while they're swimming? Okay, there are studies that show that there is some ingestion of water, but not a great deal. But imagine now how much water is in their mouth. And imagine the oropharyngeal reflexes that affect AVP and the regulation of body water and thirst and how it feeds back to the brain. Is a swimmer going to feel thirsty? I doubt it. But even if they do feel thirsty, it's another reason not to give the general recommendation, oh, let's drink to thirst. Because these athletes probably don't need that advice. And their sweat rates are quite low because of the cool water. Now, if you're in the Caribbean, it's a different story. If the water is hot, they do sweat slightly more, perhaps 2 to 3 tenths of a liter, maybe even a half a liter per hour. I'm going to talk again about David Kostel because Dave was my advisor. In the 1960s and 50s, did you know that Olympic athletes were discouraged from drinking? And in some of the events in the 1950s and in the 1960s, they could not drink on the course. There were no water stations. And it was because of a macho approach, macho view of the fact that, oh, you don't need water. And then the other view was, well, you'll get gastric upset if you drink water. And then the other view was, no, you shouldn't do that because it'll just affect your performance negatively. So in the 50s and 60s, athletes in the world championships and in the Olympics had no water stations. Now, given that, my advisor, Dave Kostel, who was one of the fathers of exercise physiology in this country, worked with Cyril Wyndham in South Africa, another great name in the physiology literature. And they went to the Olympic Committee and said, no way, we have to change this. And Dave was part of that change that in the 1970s and on put water stations at events. And then it grew to marathons and mass participation events and so forth. Now, with that background, Dave published this paper in JAMA in 1972, and he looked at running speed versus sweat rate. Nice correlations. You run faster, you sweat more, okay? Now, in 1984, I was sitting at my desk in the U.S. Army Research Institute of Environmental Medicine in Natick, Massachusetts, and I got a phone call from Alberto Salazar's father. And they lived in Cochituate, Mass, just 5 miles north of the Natick labs where I was working. And he says, hello, I'd like to get my son tested at your laboratory. And I said, sorry, sir, this is an Army laboratory and we only test soldiers here, so we can't test him. He says, well, my son is Alberto Salazar. I about dropped the phone. I said, oh, well, in that case, we're going to test him. So we got him into the laboratory, we tested him in our environmental chamber, and we looked at his sweat rate and his water intake and his body temperature, because you might know the story, he almost died at the Boston Marathon prior to that. He was in the medical tent, they read him the last rites of the Catholic Church, and he almost died. His body temperature was well over 108. And he was known as probably the toughest trainer in America. Now, by that, I mean he ran for the University of Oregon. And you know the story probably of Nike and Bowerman and all the great coaches up there and the great athletes like Prefontaine ran there. And Salazar ran there in the early 1980s. And he was known as doing training workouts that nobody else could touch. So that's why his intensity at Boston in a normally cool day was so high that he almost died of heat stroke, as Bob Salas described it last session in this series of water talks. Well, Salazar's sweat rate was 3.7 liters an hour. Now think back to the numbers I gave you on athletes a few slides ago. Drink to thirst. What? He has a 3.7 liter per hour sweat rate. Are we going to tell Alberto to drink to thirst? Why is that a problem? Well, Eddie Coyle at the University of Texas at Austin and John Ivey did a study looking at the gastric emptying rate of water that was consumed by cyclists in their chamber. And they looked at the maximal rate of gastric emptying. So when I was at Dave Costel's lab as a doctoral student, I sat around a table like these, and I participated in those gastric emptying labs. And to this day, I know my gastric emptying rate is about 0.8 liters per hour. That means that I have to really chew my food and drink slowly. Because if I don't, and I eat a big meal and I drink a lot, I have indigestion for the whole afternoon. So we have different gastric emptying rates in the room. The maximal gastric emptying rates in Coyle and Ivey's study was 1.2 to 1.5 liters per hour. Salazar's sweat rate is 3.7 liters an hour. He can't keep up. There's no way. And you might know, running at his pace, which is a 2:08 marathon at New York City, okay? This day in Los Angeles, we were preparing him for the Los Angeles Olympics, and that's why we were doing the testing for him. In the Los Angeles Olympics, his body weight change showed that he had lost 3.7 liters per hour, considering what he drank. We developed a special fluid intake bag. It was an IV bag with a flexible plastic straw, and he would grab it at the aid station, squeeze it into his mouth, and get as much as he can into his stomach. And even with that, he still experienced problems. So he lost 8% of his body weight that day. 8%. I don't think we're going to tell elite athletes to drink to thirst. Thus, my bias. I'm going to pass that slide, and I'm going to talk about finally creating an individualized drinking plan. How do you do it? What do we look at? What do athletes need? What do they need to know? In its simplest form, an individualized drinking plan measures a sweat rate and plans to match that sweat rate as closely as possible while you're drinking on the course, either if you're on a bike with the water on your frame or in your jersey or at an aid station. More sophisticated IDPs account for things like sweat electrolyte concentration, which means that you need to do a whole body wash down to measure the sweat electrolyte, and also thinking about the composition of fluids. So basically, you design a simulation of your event. You cycle or you run in a hot environment. You consider the event and fluid availability. Are there aid stations? Can you carry your water with you? You determine your sweat rate, as I mentioned earlier. Weigh your body weight, exercise for an hour, weigh it again, see how much weight you lost. That's about your closest estimate of your sweat rate. And then finally, select your fluid and your plan. Factors to consider: do you need water or a fluid electrolyte beverage? Carbohydrates. And by the way, 6% to 8% carbohydrate in a fluid optimizes stomach emptying. And if you look at these sport drinks, 6 to 8%. They knew. If exercise is more than 1 hour, the carbohydrate should be taken in at a rate of 30 to 60 grams per hour. That's quite a bit. If exercise is less than an hour, there's really no evidence to support the idea that you need carbs. So if you're out for a half a mile competition, even if it's a 5K, half an hour, under an hour, no evidence that there's a benefit of consuming carbohydrate for that. Carbonation, probably not. Taste, yes, it should be palatable. Caffeine, ergogenic aid, you might want to include that. And no, caffeine does not dehydrate the body. That's another story. And sodium may be beneficial because glucose and sodium tend to increase the rate of water absorption. Sodium and other electrolytes increase palatability and might maintain thirst, promoting drinking. Sodium replaces sweat losses to a degree. But let me say that there are quite a few studies that show that drinking higher sodium fluids do not forestall or eliminate the risk of exercise-associated hyponatremia. It helps a little, but it doesn't seem to solve the problem. Longer than 2 hours due to the high sodium and sweat or the sweat losses, then it's recommended that you begin to include sodium in the fluids. For example, in American football, during double workout sessions, a loss of 10 liters of sweat can result in 11,000 milligrams of sodium in a big lineman, a large football lineman. That greatly exceeds the 110 milligrams of sodium in a bottle of fluid electrolyte beverage. So you can start to see that over 2 hours of endurance exercise, you may need sodium in the fluid. Before exercise, drink this amount, 400 to 600 ml, 2 hours before. Why? Well, then that allows you to empty the bladder and you don't have the problem of early in the exercise having to run to the porta-john. Finally, fluid intake should not exceed fluid loss. Avoid gaining weight. For a sophisticated individualized drinking plan, here's a paper that Doug Casa at the University of Connecticut and I published in 2009. It gives all the details on how to do this, including the whole body wash down to find out what the concentration of your sweat is. How many people here know your sweat rate? Aren't you ashamed of yourself? I'm teasing. How many people know their sweat sodium concentration? Obviously, if you don't know your rate, you don't know the sweat sodium concentration. But if you're OCD about your planned drinking, you'll be measuring your sweat concentration and your sweat rate, and you'll put that into your plan if you're really compulsive about it. All right, I'm going to stop there.
Awesome, thank you. So if you have questions, please add them in the Q&A section for the online people, if there are any questions here from the audience. Any questions from you?
Yeah, so referring back to your Ball State study with the drinking the diuretics or using diuretics and running what
Yes.
5K or a 5 kilometer kilometer.
Yes.
Do you believe a study like that or institutional review board would approve of?
Well, we had it approved by the IRB at that point, but I'll be honest.
Well, I'm saying today.
Today, correct. Ancient. Believe it or not, Dave Costa was a member of the IRB. So
Go figure.
that greased the skids a little bit. I remember thinking that as a doctoral student. I remember that because I sat on the IRB at the University of Connecticut for 2 years, and I sat on the IRB at USARIUM, Natick, Mass for 2 years, the Army Research Institute. And today, if these are accomplished athletes, I think that would be your argument. They experience this normally. And anytime you deal with an IRB and you can show that people get this day to day to day in their normal life or in their extreme activities like extreme endurance exercise, if you can convince the IRB of that, I think you have a much better chance. But I never try to second guess IRBs. Thank you for that question.
I have a brother who's a competitive wrestler. He's approaching wrestling season and he plans to lose 6 to 8 pounds of water weight in a day. What would you recommend to rehydrate and have optimal performance for wrestling competition?
Oh, Stavros, could you reshow the slides? I'm sorry. I apologize. The question was, her brother loses, did you say 6 to 8%?
6 to 8 pounds in a day.
6 to 8 pounds
I've
a
eaten
day.
16 pounds in 4 days of water weight before too, which
Okay.
is really strenuous. And I feel like wrestlers are not very educated in how to hydrate.
Well, and by the way, to make weight, which they all do, almost all, to make weight, they want to lose weight. And how do they do it? I won't describe the ways they lose water, okay? You know. But sometimes they do take Lasix or a diuretic. And I'll point you to this paper, which we just published 5 months ago in April. And it talks about reference values for hydration biomarkers. There's no particular set of reference values anywhere that I know of. So athletes like your brother can go to these different assessments. And we use, by the way, body mass loss, urine specific gravity with a refractometer. Simple. You can buy one of these online now for under $50. And thirst assessment, either with a scale or with a visual analog scale, 100 millimeters. You check the box, and then the investigator measures the distance from left to right, and that talks about the intensity of thirst. This is a list of reference values for hydration biomarkers. And notice football, collegiate, well-trained competitive runners, well-trained experienced runners, recreational boxing, tennis, and cross country. So this is during training and competition. This one is about rapid body weight loss or making weight, just as your brother does as a wrestler, okay? And we looked at only studies that gave either body mass and urine specific gravity or all three, body mass, urine specific gravity, rating of thirst. And notice we have pre-measurements in most cases and post-measurements. So he could look at his values of thirst and body mass and urine specific gravity. And here we have Taekwondo, boxing and wrestling, judo, Division I wrestlers. There he is. So he could check himself once he makes weight, but as you know, they only have sometimes only an hour or two before the contest. In some cases, they weigh in the night before and then they gorge on water or drink more. This one is about ultra endurance road cyclists, 2 of them who experienced hyponatremia. And we again have urine specific gravity, body mass change, and serum sodium for hyponatremic patients. And this was from the Hotter Than Hell 100 event. And here's one more, 2 more, 24 healthy young adults who conducted routine daily activities, just going about their daily activities. Your brother could use something like this. And finally, this was actually a study that we conducted at the University of Connecticut. 14 healthy young men, free living, refrained from exercise. They restricted water for 1 day, 24 hours. And notice that their body mass change was 2.1% just for not drinking 1 day. And then their urine specific gravity went from 0.020, the classic number you hear for dehydration, to 1.030. Then they drank water for 30 minutes in this column, and you can see what it did to specific gravity. Not much, quite a bit to body weight, but it really dropped the thirst rating. And then finally, a day later, 24 hours later, basically going back to normal for most things there. So it's these kinds of reference values that your brother could use. Thanks for asking that question about this paper. I wanted to talk about it, but I ran out of time. I did not plant her in the audience.
Professor Armstrong, much of your research has shaped our current understanding of hydration and exercise. Which of your findings do you believe has had the greatest impact on sports medicine practice?
Wow. So the question is, which of my research has had the greatest effect on sports medicine practice? I think the urine color chart is probably the answer to that. Oh, I just happen to have a few. I'm gonna give one of these to everybody in the room. This color chart was developed at the University of Connecticut. We were the first. And I know now, Dr. Warden, your colleague is doing much more with it, even a 3D urine color chart. Lo and behold, okay? We found that this correlates quite well. In fact, I think I can find that slide if I hurry back here. Oh, I know, it's on the other end. Pardon me. There it is. So this slide shows that when you look at urine osmolality on the top graph versus urine specific gravity, wow. Nailed. Almost 0.95, 0.99. So osmolality and specific gravity, not surprisingly, relate quite well. Urine color is shown in the next two graphs, the middle one and the bottom one, and we compared those to specific gravity and osmolality of the urine. And still we got R squared of 0.8 and R squared of 0.82. So this color chart gives the average person a good indicator of urine osmolality and urine specific gravity. And please take one, and I have more if you need more. So that I think would be really practical, useful application. The rest.
Right, thank you. For sake of time, we won't go through all the questions. But is it okay if somebody would like to reach out to you and send you an email?
Yes, let me put that slide up. Thank you. There's my information. That's my email at the university. They still let you retired professors use their email system. That's good. And my bibliography on the National Library of Medicine, NIH, is listed here.
Thank you very much.